On today's World Insight, rising U.S. trade barriers with higher tariffs on goods taking effect February 1. So amid hurdles to trade, what's the outlook on the world economy?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with Li Tianwei. The U.S. has announced to impose 25% of tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico and 10% on imports from China. But will raising tariffs be any part of the solution to complex problems? With many parts of the world facing potential tariff hikes from the new U.S. administration, what's the challenges and opportunities ahead? Let's loop in our panelists. In Doha, I'm joined by Susana Manos, a managing partner of GBA Latin America Trade and Investment Advisors. In Portland, Yan Liang, Kramer Chair, Professor of Economics from Willamette University. Last but not least, in Henderson, William Lee, the Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. U.S. President Donald Trump has been suggesting about 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada, 10% tariffs on China. Your immediate response, please, Mr. Lee.
Well, I think we were all expecting President Trump to do something with tariffs to show that he is actually serious about using tariffs as a policy tool. And what I think is differentiating this use of tariffs from what he did before is that he's now using economic tools as a policy instrument to achieve non-economic goals. And in this case, he's asking Mexico and Canada, hey, close your borders, stop this immigration from passing through as though it was like water through a sieve, and do something about the fentanyl trade, which is plaguing our inner cities. So these non-economic goals, which is really a very integral part of the Make America Great agenda, is something he's addressing using a very powerful economic tool, which is tariffs.
So Mr. Lee suggests that's a tool for MAGA's role on the immigrants and the fentanyl issue. To you, Ms. Manos.
Raising tariffs on Mexican products will not only result in increased prices of imports of U.S. manufacturing sector, but also will increase prices on many agricultural consumer products that the average American citizen consumes. So, of course, it will cause inflation in the country. And the second thing is both Mexican President, Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum, and also the President from Canada, the Minister from Canada, Mr. Trudeau, have announced that they will retaliate if the U.S. imposes tariffs. So this will be a tit-for-tat scenario, and therefore the economy, Mexican economy and consumers will also suffer from this scenario, and of course American exporters, as Mexico is the main destination for many U.S. goods.
Ms. Liang?
I think for Trump, it's clear that he sees tariff as an omnipotent kind of tool. Not only it can help to raise revenues for the United States, as he talked about, he wants to establish external revenue services, but also it's for him a very effective tool to revitalize industrialization in the United States, bring back jobs. But now one more layer to it is to achieve some of his foreign policy objectives. And actually, this, I think, is his domestic priorities when it comes to, drug crises and also border control issues. So it's very, I think it's not surprising that he's going to use these tariff tools. But I also agree that these tools is going to create counterproductive effects when it comes to, for example, inflation. These two countries are responsible for 30% of the trade with the United States, and that's 1.8 trillion US dollars back in 2023. And these two countries are also very responsible for exporting a lot of automobiles and parts to the United States, as well as energies. So even, the tariff on the energies will be relatively lower when it comes to, the oil coming from Canada. Still, I think the consumers will really feel the negative impacts when they pump up their gas and when they're getting their gas or when they're buying, fruits in the supermarkets. And so, or when they buy cars. So I think, this tool, this tariff, I think on the one hand is very disheartening because these two are the closest allies of the United States, and the leaders from both countries have pledged that they are going to cooperate on both of the immigration and also drug crisis issues. And yet still, they're being imposed the tariffs. And not to mention, these three North American countries have reached the USMCA deal back in 2018 under President Trump, the first term. So this is a completely sort of ripping off, right, the previous agreements, just using tariff as
Right.
really a stick to make these two countries to cooperate.
What do you make, all of you, of the US President Donald Trump using tariff as a tool to achieve some of the other objectives rather than trade itself? Ms. Manos.
Yeah, definitely. Trump is using tariffs as a leverage for negotiating other topics. In the case of Mexico and Canada, related to immigration and to security. And the challenge for the countries is to keep all these topics in different negotiation tables, as some analysts have called this a Mexican standoff, where there's not going to be any real benefits from this situation. Although, of course, there's different estimates of what will be the implications of these tariffs. In the case of Mexico, the Ministry of Economy just recently, yesterday, shared some data related that saying the U.S. Will impose, if it imposes a 25% tariffs to Mexico exports, there will be impacts in the prices of automobile sector, on computers. So definitely, there will be a damage in the American economy. To what extent, we still don't know, because we know there's tariffs coming. We don't know where they will be implemented, because there's still time. Some people or some analysts expect that these tariffs will be announced, but then implemented put into force maybe in March, as a way to allow this time for negotiations in these two topics, in Mexico and Canada. And we also expect that it could be that U.S. or Trump will push the revision of the USMCA further into, closer from 2026. So I think this is another topic that will be brought once they announce the tariffs.
Well, it seems that everything is on the table right now, but earlier there were cases about Colombia and the United States by threatening of using tariffs. It seems that apparently Colombia succumbed to the kowtowed, in a way, to the fact that there might be a threat of tariff, and therefore try to cooperate with the Trump administration on immigrant issues. So, Ms. Manos, does that ring alarm to the ears of those in Canada and particularly in Mexico?
2018, we have experience with this situation happening when the U.S. announced tariffs for steel and aluminum imports. Canada and Mexico retaliated, and in the case of Mexico, we imposed tariffs into cheese, quite a few agricultural products from the U.S., pork meat, blueberries, potatoes. And of course, it was the U.S. producers who put pressure on the U.S. government to reduce these tariffs into Mexico, in order to be able to export to Mexico market again. So retaliation is a tool that Mexico and Canada can use. Many industries in the U.S., the main consumer are, well, at least in agricultural products, for many products, the main consumers are in Mexico and Canada. So definitely there will be a painful impact if these tariffs go on, and Mexico and Canada use this as retaliate to these tariffs.
Mr. Lee?
Well, I think the fact that Colombia actually acted just with the threat of a tariff shows the effectiveness of tariffs as a policy tool to achieve non-economic objectives. And the fact that the Canadians and the Mexicans have said, yes, we'll try to stiffen up our border controls, but because President Trump didn't feel they were serious enough efforts to contain things by Canada and Mexico, he's actually put in place the mechanism for raising tariffs. And I think that's a contrast to what President Biden did. President Biden did exactly what Ms. Munoz said to do, which is separate your issues, have separate tables, and address them separately. Well, it showed that after 4 years of that approach, our domestic situation is worse than ever. The border control is completely collapsed. the fentanyl situation has worsened. And so I think the issue of bringing it together and doing as Donald Trump says is to use a very powerful tool, whether it's economic or not, and to address these problems is something that is, I think, his probably biggest contribution to political science, which is to say, let's use non-standard tools in this negotiating approach. And I think the notion of a tariff is, it is as big as it's going to take to get people to act. And I think that's the key to the Trump administration going forward. We will use whatever economic tools we have, and our main tool is access to the broad U.S. market. It's something that's desirable for every country in the world to sell things in the United States. And if you want to do that, then there's a cost of doing that.
Yeah.
And I think President Trump used tariffs to say these are the costs. And if you do things that and act as a partner and as a friend of the United States, you'll get many benefits. But if you choose to be a competitor or not, do things that we have asked you to do repeatedly, that are also in your interest to close your borders, then you will have to pay a price to enter the U.S. market.
Ms. Manos, would you like to respond to that?
I think that the situation here, being honest, the reality is that Mexico did not do much during the previous administration related to immigration and to security. So what is happening now in the U.S. border, what is happening now with the federal crisis is a result of the really low action of the Mexican government towards these two topics during the previous administration. So I'm not sure if really imposing tariffs, well, definitely will force the Mexican government to do things, but I'm not sure that the situation could be definitely solved just by imposing tariffs and forcing the Mexican government to do something about it. Because at the end, these topics are related to cooperation. The drugs issues are related to cooperation. It's just not Mexico can stop drugs from passing to Mexico if there's no consumers in the U.S. So there you need cooperation with the U.S. authorities. Immigration, of course, you can stop as many. Well, Trump built a wall in Mexico without even investing money. But the truth is that there is a humanitarian crisis coming in the Mexican-U.S. border. The U.S.-Mexico border is not a gate that opens and closes according to the U.S. President's command. It's a 2,000-mile border, and unless you put one soldier after the other to really monitor no one is crossing the border, people will try to go again to the U.S., whether and it will need much more than the Mexican army or the Mexican policy or the Mexican policymakers or the Mexican will to stop this immigration.
What about the other issue, trade mechanism among the three countries, North American countries, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, as a result of possible imposing of tariffs by the United States to the other two economies? What would that mean, likely, to this trade mechanism? Mr. Lee.
Well, that's a great question. In fact, I'm glad you brought it up because one of the terms of the USMCA is that tariffs such a situation would not be used under normal circumstances, and in fact, the agreement restricts its use, except under an economic emergency of the sort that we have now. And because President Trump has declared the emergency, that allows him to use the tariff that is fully consistent with the USMCA. So I think that was part of the negotiating that was put in there. And I think the negotiators were wise enough on the part of the United States to allow that clause to be slipped in because we are now facing an economic emergency, an emergency of existential sovereignty. And I think I don't want to be too flowery about these words, but Donald Trump views the situation as being serious enough to declare the emergency that's needed to put in place emergency powers, which include the use of tariffs.
All right. Ms. Manos, what does that mean to this trade mechanism, trilateral trade mechanism?
It is not consistent with the USMCA. It is violated to the USMCA. and it will definitely create will not create the conditions to continue with this conversation. And in my opinion, what Trump is trying to do is mostly to push the revision of the USMCA. It will push them to revise the USMCA before the 2026.
What does that mean, revising of the USMCA?
The USMCA is going to be revised in 2026. In my opinion, what Trump is doing is pushing these tariffs and putting the 3 topics on the table is to make sure that from now until 2026, with the revision of the USMCA is scheduled to happen, he will start he will push this conversation to start earlier. So in order to change the conditions of the USMCA.
Ms. Liang, you have been a researcher of trade and economic issues. What would this mean, the exercising of tariffs on trade partners for a broader mechanism, even beyond the USMCA? Let's just say under the WTO mechanism. After all, U.S. is still a member of it.
The United States was the one that spearheaded the international neoliberal system, back in 80 years ago. And so I think the United States, Donald Trump maybe is an exception, but many of the U.S., politicians and likewise have the interest in some ways to maintain the kind of current order. But when you really, in a way, I would say abuse and misuse this sort of national securities, right? It really disrupts the international system. And I think, again, it will backfire on the United States, even if it's not relying a lot of trade per se for its economy. It has gone through this deindustrialization process, for decades.
Okay.
And so in many important consumer goods and industrial products, the United States does rely on the rest of the world. And so I think, in the short term, again, Donald Trump may be able to use tariff to achieve certain, short-term objectives. But I don't think this is going to be really effective way going forward when you're taking a more medium and long-term perspective. But of course, he wouldn't care, right? This is going to be only 4 years.
Exactly. The question is, he only served 4 years, and this is his last term. Would he care, Mr. Li, about longer-term impact? Is the U.S. interest the ultimate interest that the U.S. president needs to think about? Or there are other interests that will have much impact on the U.S. interest, both in the middle and the longer term, even in the short term, that the U.S. president also needs to think about. That's probably the question, the ultimate question here. Meanwhile, whether the use of tariff will strengthen the U.S. role as a trade nation or not, that's also an interesting question. Your take?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, those are very good points to bring out. And in fact, those are points that I think I've made earlier in other appearances on your show, to say that the tariffs are a tool to bring people together to negotiate. And the terms of negotiation are to each other's benefits. And I think, the ultimate sanctions that are put in place is to try to deter bad behavior on the rest of the world. And so the legacy for Donald Trump is that he wants to show the world that he can be a leader, to be able to set up an infrastructure, a political, economic infrastructure that will serve the world in the 21st century.
Yeah.
I said to you before that the trade deal they were trying to negotiate in Trump 1.0 was a 21st century trade framework between the 2 largest economies in the world. That didn't get very far, but I hope it'll get further this time. But I think the vision that Donald Trump has now, more so than ever, is the legacy he leaves for not just the United States, but the rest of the world.
Okay.
And the fact that he's inviting the world in to invest in the United States is the very best he can offer in terms of a carrot to be able to invest in the United States.
Ms. Liang?
Well, again, I would respectfully disagree. I think tariff is, it's a coercion, it's economic coercion. So with other economic sanctions, we know that 60% of the developing countries are under one form or the other, the United States economic sanctions. And that means human life losses, that means country's economy get destroyed, and so on and so forth. One thing that Donald Trump did, the first thing was to reimpose sanctions on Cuba, which that the President Biden lifted in the final days of his administration. So I think, again, I'm just really concerned about the way that the United States has been using tariff and other sort of economic coercion. And also he said when it comes to Greenland and other matters, Panama for that matter, Panama Canal for that matter, he does not promise not to use military means. So I think all of this is very concerning. So at the end of the day, I think it really matters when it comes to the new world order, so to speak, right? The United States has been playing this unilateral role and having this sort of one-man show in the world. And whenever the U.S. sets the rule, the rest of the world it has to follow. And I think now we're in a very different world. And I don't think that countries wanted to live in that same unipolar kind of world anymore. So it inevitably does create tensions. The United States saying that it can use tariff and other means to coerce other countries. For what, I think it will push some of the global South countries more together. I think, Panama is a wake-up call for the Latin American countries, whether or not they'll be able to build solidarity and unity to confront, right, with this mega power. And I think, for the U.S. as allies, the same thing will happen. The Europeans probably will need to think hard about their strategic autonomy, learning from the sort of the lessons and so on and so forth. So I think it will be very interesting to see the next 4 years and how countries are going to cope.
Ms. Munoz, your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely, I'll have to agree with Yan Liang in the sense that this is a new world. China, we can't forget the influence that China is having in many countries in the South, Latin America and Africa, for what it takes. China is now the main trade partner and the main investing partner in many countries in Latin America and in Africa. And of course, after what happened with Colombia, many bridges were burned after that situation. Of course, the U.S. won, but at what cost? At what political cost it won? So it will definitely change the willingness of many countries that are not that close to the U.S. Mexico is a different issue, and it will force them to definitely start searching new partners. For growth, for investment, for technology, for trade.
About China, we saw the possibility of 10% tariffs on Chinese imports to the United States on top of the already existing tariffs. Ms. Liang, on the one hand, China, as far as I understand, do not want to be an antagonist with the United States. On the other hand, China needs to guard what they consider as important rights of its own development in trade, for example, against the tariffs coming from the United States. Now, how is China likely to find that good balance between these two goals?
Right. This is a great question. I think from China's perspective, retaliation is necessary to deter further aggression. So we have already seen that China had imposed and also strengthened some of the export bans on some of the critical minerals like gallium, germanium, and graphite. So this is a way for targeted, I think, retaliation. Now, of course, China does not want to go full-blown sort of decoupling. For example, some people suggesting that China may, in a way, sort of harass, right, some of these foreign companies in China, make their lives harder, and so on and so forth. I don't think this is really in the interest of China, right? China wants to have stable relationship, constructive relationship with the United States, and it definitely understands any actions of the retaliation or decoupling are going to create, lose-lose situation. But at the same time, China cannot not, retaliate because it will show that, China can be sort of bully around. So I think you're right. This is a very fine balance. But I think the signal is very clear that China is not going to offend in a sense, but it's going to take a defensive role, a defensive move if the kinds of imposition of tariff does go through.
Mr. Li, your thoughts?
I hang out with a lot of businessmen, policymakers, and very few academics these days. And I think the consensus of views that I've heard is that when you are coming to the negotiating table and someone has put a threat onto your business, right? The first thing you want to do is certainly not retaliate because that shuts down negotiations. The one thing you want to do is find out what the purpose of that threat was.
Ms. Liang, on the issue of to retaliate or not? That is an interesting question, but to what extent also interesting. On the other hand, we see China has been rising in a way in different sectors, including the latest development on DeepSeek, after the US announced its important plan to beef up the AI infrastructure plan. How do you see the two countries' negotiating styles and also the two countries' different views about what a big power in the world should do and their responsibilities?
I think that goes back to the bigger question, which is, how do you reconcile the differences and get what you want when they deal with great powers between yourselves? So again, you can't expect the countries don't retaliate when you impose the tariffs in the first place in order to get what you want. And second of all, I think China does, already reduce the reliance on the U.S. as an export market. Trump first term, China's exports to the United States about 19% of China's total export. Right now, it's about 14.6%. So China has pivoted away, in a way, right, to quote unquote dumping its goods in the U.S. market. But again, nothing has changed when it comes to the U.S.'s trade deficit. When it comes to its overall trade deficit, it's still hovering around 900 billion, 1 trillion. The trade deficit with China has reduced, but its trade deficit with other countries has increased. So I think, again, these means that there are two major reasons why the U.S. is running trade deficit. It has nothing to do with China dumping its goods. It has to do with, the U.S.'s role as the international reserve currency, that countries desire to have the U.S. dollars, and so they are exporting to the United States. And second, the U.S.'s internal imbalances that lead to the external deficit. But having said that, going back to the AI issue, I think, yes, from the DeepSeek, we see the very different paths that these two countries have taken. For the United States, it's a big money game. It has racked up hundreds of billions of dollars investments, and they just, requested SoftBank to increase the investment from 100 billion to now 500 billion to establish this Stargate project to build infrastructure, more or less 20 mega data center in the United States, and making it AI as a priority knowledge. On the other hand, I think China shows a very different approach. It's trying to make it more accessible. It's an open source. It's not a big money game. It's a fraction of a cost to develop these DeepSeek foundational model. And it's, again, open source. And so I think this is a very different approach. But I think, at the AI space, you still need collaboration, because I think when it comes to technological development, cooperation can go a long way. When you look at the current, major sort of the AI research papers, a lot of times you have a Chinese co-author and, citing Chinese content. So I think, cooperation is the key. Not to mention, I think the AI governance. That, again, takes a lot of collaboration between countries so that you can set up the ground rules when it comes to the AI ethics and also in terms of the security issues.
Including China and the United
despite
States.
The differences,
Yeah. Right. Well, we put a lot of things on the table already, and that is the thing that many are concerned about in the world. If you put everything onto the table, these things got entangled, and whether you will be able to sort it out is another question. But having said that, though, I really appreciate all your input and different views at this point. Discussions are certainly needed, as well as they are good intentioned. Thank you so much, Yan Liang, Susanna Munoz, last but not least, William Li. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.